So today we're going to talk a little bit about message market fit, what it is, and how to find it. So let's jump in. So again, native digital brand and marketing firm. We're proudly based in Kansas City. The reason I think most of us have joined on today, we've got plenty of things to do, but we're all basically looking for growth and figuring out the best path to get there. We see charts that look like this, and we aspire to create these types of charts to show that the methods that we're using, the tactics that we're using, the messages that we're creating are leading to this type of growth curve. But when you look at these curves, when you start to see things jump up, we always look at that and think, oh, how did they get there? Like, what was it that caused it? And we spend a lot of our time deconstructing tactics, looking at people who have accomplished this and figuring out what was it that they did. Oftentimes you're going to look at it from different factors. Was it the brand? Was it the product? Was it just an opportunity? Was it a timing? What are the things that got you there? And so we're going to look at one of the major factors for helping find that growth curve. Now, if you're on this call, my guess is you're very familiar with the concept of product market fit. It's wildly popular. It's something that a lot of people are aspiring towards. And so product market fit is something that most of us are trying to achieve, even whether we're in the tech sector or outside of it. It's a concept that makes a lot of sense for anybody who's building a product, working in sales and marketing. The thing about product market fit is it's often easy to understand what it is. It's often hard to get there. It's very difficult to achieve. Oftentimes the product and the market are pretty far apart. So fit is the method. Fit's the method because it precedes growth. It's difficult to achieve. So what we're going to do is try to dissect that a little bit today and figure out what's a major factor for helping bring those two areas together. There is an asterisk here. The asterisk here is that if you're familiar with the concept of a viral coefficient and a customer leads to 2 customers or a customer leads to 5 customers, if you have a viral coefficient above 2, messaging is not going to be as important to you because you've got something way more desirable. The truth is very few people have viral coefficients above that number. So if that's a new concept to you, it's worth looking into. The other piece is if you are a first mover or mature and kind of a dominant force in your industry and your market share is over 50%, again, messaging may not be the number one thrust. For everybody else, some of the concepts we're going to talk about today are going to be very important. So let's zoom in a little bit. If we acknowledge that right now we're working with a brand or a product, and the product and the market are not quite aligned yet, how can we figure out ways to bring those closer together? And so I think as you zoom in on product market fit, a couple of things emerge. One is the front-facing discipline of the product is the sales and marketing team. This is why we call marketing. It is understanding what the market is and being that conduit from the product to the market. That's why we got that name. I think a lot of people forget that. And so if you look at the market and you start to look at your target audiences, and then you drill down to the needs and motivators, what is that thing that connects your sales and marketing discipline to the needs and motivators of your target market? Well, it emerges as the topic that we're talking about today, which is messaging. Messaging is that connection piece. It is that connective tissue between sales, marketing, and the needs and motivators. Really hard to have a compelling message if you don't understand the needs and motivators of your audience. So it's really worthwhile to tap into that and understand them. And those evolve over time. Your target market is constantly evolving organism, and their jobs to be done are continually changing. And the landscape with which you fit in also is changing. So messaging, a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about today may seem kind of high level and may seem almost common sense. It's because messaging is like water. It's all around us. You can't function without it, but it's also completely taken for granted. Most of us drink clean water every day without being amazed at the access we have to it. What we want to make sure, though, is that the messaging we have is pure, is clean, is worthwhile. If you look at the places where a strong message is beneficial, it's everywhere. It's helpful in ad creative, it's helpful in content, website landing pages, nurture emails, social media, sales collateral, sales outreach, sales presentations. even in the customer experience, it's pretty much everything. There isn't many things that project what the product value prop is that doesn't include messaging. And so if you look at all these different touch points, again, oftentimes what we find is that we have messages that conflict with each other. Some are weaker than others. Some are not consistent. Some have different tones. Sometimes based on who authored it, it's going to have different points, different tones, all of these types of things. So what we wanted to talk about with the time we're going to spend here today is how do we diagnose if our messaging is ineffective? How do we justify the investment, which I believe is a big piece of this. If you don't have budget and time and resources to address your messaging, you're probably always going to struggle with it, right? It's always going to be that thing that's taken for granted and is the last thing you look at. So we have to really be able to justify the messaging. And so that really shows you need to kind of isolate this thing that is so ever present, isolate it in some way where you can say, if it's stronger, it's worth more. And then we'll talk about 7 factors on how to fix it. So today's not going to be a technical tutorial. It's going to be more of a high level understanding of when is it off? When is it on? How do we make sure that we have budget for it, which is difficult? And then what's 7 ways to help improve it? So let's first talk about diagnosing the messaging. Is it strong? Is it weak? How can we help? Really tried to make this a very simple diagram, something you can almost just keep in the back of your mind. You don't even have to have this on a piece of paper. In the back of your mind, you can almost memorize these. And when you look at messaging, you can evaluate it on these 4 factors. So the 4 factors we're going to look at here to help evaluate the strength of messaging. And I would say this could be worth printing this out and looking at a variety of your messaging. The first one is looking at campaigns with a click-through rate, understanding where the industry standard is, where your historical performance has been, and what tends to be your spectrum of options there based on the messages that you're putting out. Are you underperforming or are you overperforming? The same thing can be done with landing page conversion rates. Once you have driven traffic, whether paid or organic, to those landing pages, what's the conversion rate? What's the expectation? What's that success and failure criteria? And are you under it or are you above it? The same thing can be used in sales and marketing teams. So if you're talking with your sales team, what's their close rate? Now, there's a lot of factors that go into that based on the quality of leads that they have, the presentations, the strength of the sales team itself, but it's still another variable to be worthwhile. And I mean, who doesn't want a higher close rate? So if you start to see a trend here and everything's a little bit below where you should be, messaging is going to pop out as probably one of the things that needs some work. And then the last thing is use your intuition on this as well. If it doesn't excite you, if it's not interesting to you, the first few times when you see it, if it's putting you to sleep, your intuition is trying to tell you something. But even after being exposed to it over and over again, you still believe in it. You still feel like it's strong. That's intuition telling you as well that, hey, this is feeling good. So we want to bring in data, but it's also good to lean on your intuition as well. Sometimes things feel right. Sometimes they just don't feel right. So hopefully this is simple enough for you guys to put into use, or if nothing else, memorize. So then let's talk about justification. Let's say we've scored ourselves and we're not as high as we want to be. Maybe we're just a hair below what we think the industry standard is, and we believe we need to get above that. To address this, you might have budget to do it. You might have time and resources. In many cases, you don't, right? There's always something else screaming for your attention. And this thing that's sort of ever present, semi-vague, is really difficult to stop and say, let's talk about something that is hard to put our finger on. So let's try to put our finger on this and say, all right, this is the value of a stronger message. So I'm going to throw it way back to when Barack Obama ran for office. This is a case study that many of you have seen before. It kind of made the rounds online. But these are numbers that were well reported and had a really high data set as well, and was able to really quickly show the value of a strong message in multivariate testing. So what they did was, on the left side is the original ad unit that they had, and then we have 2 other variants. In the chat, does anybody want to, let's just call this A, B, and C. Does anybody want to guess, without Googling this case study, anybody want to guess which one was the highest performing, A, B, or C? Yeah, good guesses. So I gave it one hint in the sense that the left side is the original, right? So you guys aren't guessing that one. Let's show what the original was and what the top one was. So everybody who guessed B is correct. That was the highest performing ad unit combo that they had. So what they're looking at here is message of the copy. They're looking at the visuals of the images, and they're also looking at the language on the sign up buttons. They tested all of these individually. So it wasn't just 3 ads, it was all different variants here. The original sign up rate was pretty high. You're talking to people who are fairly well qualified once they've gotten to this point. 8.3 led to an increase in 11.6. Depending on where you are in your career, what position you have, a lot of people will look at that and say, "Oh, good, that's a nice jump there," and then they move right on to their next meeting and their next conversation. If you were to run this through at this scale, that 3.3% increase actually led to 2.8 million signups. The average value of that signup was $21. That 3.3% increase led to an additional $60 million in donations. So again, once you get to a certain scale, these, what seemingly at a glance looks like a small jump, leads to huge implications on the backside. Now, again, that's at a large scale, but that's what we're going for, right? And by making those jumps, it's really important. So this is where you can take percentages and turn them into dollars if you can understand what the value of that goal that you just accomplished are. So if you understand what a goal completion is, what an acquisition looks like, you can turn those percentages and those jumps into dollars. So let's just simulate a few pieces here. And let's do a little bit more marketing math. And we're going to use just a fictional example here. So let's just say that we're going to call this input. We're going to look at inputs and outputs. Let's say we have a brand that's investing $100,000. We'll just say that's in a month's period of time. That is their input. They're investing 100K a month. And let's say we're going to run that into paid media. And in paid media, we get about 3.3 million eyeballs on that. And about 1% of those click through. So now we're looking at that number of sessions, and we're looking at a conversion rate of about 6. It's getting about 8,000 goal completions, and we're going to make this any industry. So we're just going to talk about goal completions. We'll say the value of that goal completion is $50. So in the end, what they get out of it in value is 400K. So a lot of people would look at this in many different industries and say, this is a good investment. You're spending $1 and making 4. We're happy with this. But what we want to do when we're looking at this is there's 2 factors here that we can have a heavy influence on. Number one, we can spend more, we can spend less, but it's that click-through rate and that conversion rate that can be huge changes in levers. So what is it that's going to cause those to go up or down? Well, there's a lot of factors, but one of them that works for both is the message, right? So the message, you have to have a message to get people to click through. You have to have a message to get people to convert. They may not be the same, and what leads from one then has to lead to the other. So let's just simulate what happens if we were to have the click-through rate go up 1% or the conversion rate go up 8%. It's easy to look at reports and reports and reports and see a little fluctuations of 1% or 2% and not really pay close attention. But if you kind of look at the full picture of what's being invested and what's coming out the other side, by jumping up in this case from 1% to 2% and 6 to 8, you go to a 1, you have a 10x payoff. So instead of 4-to-1 ROI, you now have 10-to-1 ROI. So this is basic math. A lot of you guys are already doing this stuff, but it's just a good reminder that you get both of those factors improved. A message is the commonality between those 2 factors. Messaging starts to look a whole lot more valuable and worth the investment. So these types of scenarios of saying this is where we're at, and if we could just find a way to get our message to increase by this amount, look at what we could get to. Those are the types of arguments that anybody in the C-suite can understand and say, all right, here's some money to go figure this out. And then you come back to them and say, this is what we were able to accomplish. So when you run through those types of models, what I've noticed firsthand in my experience is that the people who have been in marketing for a number of years, let's just say 10 years, they're 10 years in, they're starting to figure some stuff out. Typically at some point in their career, they've felt a real appreciation for the science of marketing. They can talk to you about CAC, they can talk to you about LTV, They can tell you the ins and outs of all of this kind of modeling. And what I've found is that once they've obsessed about that for a couple of years, their new obsession becomes the art of copywriting. And I've seen it in a number of marketers that I admire, which is they talk about CAC all the time, LTV all the time. And a couple of years later, the only thing they're talking about, check their LinkedIn feed, it's all switched over to copywriting. And so I think that's so interesting that that's sort of this progression of marketers. I've seen other people come up the other way. They start in the creative world. And in the creative world, they're trying to understand how to message to people. And eventually they want to understand what the value of that messaging is. And then they get to CAC. So it's almost this rite of passage to go from one to the other, I believe. For those of you on the message line that are asking about CAC and LTV, so we're talking about customer acquisition. So what is the cost to acquire a new customer? As well as what's the value of that customer? What's the value of that customer in the first instant versus also just the lifetime of that customer, right? So it's a good concept to go into if you're in that progression of your career where you're learning both of these things. So let's talk about Fix. And what we're going to do is we're just going to hit 7 highlights here, mostly to spark a couple ideas here. Some of the stuff you guys are already doing, a few of them might be good reminders for you. So let's talk about Fix. Let's talk about the first one here in the 7. This is to be understanding, know your audience. So here's an example of one of our clients. They are an e-commerce D2C swimwear brand. And we always approach this with a couple different angles. It's not just writing random copy and throwing spaghetti at the wall and throwing it out to the market to test. It is, all right, one of these statements is going to basically sell the value prop of confidence. Another one is going to be about fit. So another way to say that is one is a product attribute, another one is an outcome. I personally am a big fan of outcome based copy. I think product copy oftentimes is the low-hanging fruit that doesn't perform as well. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you can be very experienced in this and be completely wrong. So in this case, we had one that's confidence message, one that's a fit message. When we ran this, it was the fit that stood out and actually outperformed. This was not what I would have predicted. I would have predicted the one on the left. So again, what we found was that it outperformed. The ROAS, the return on ad spend, was 6, whereas the other one was 4. Both are good. And we could have been satisfied with the one on the left. But we kept pushing it further, tested multiple options, and got it up to 6. So now 6 is our new benchmark. So 6 is the number for us to beat. And this is how we stair step up and become more and more high performing with these ad units. It's also how we reduce that cost of acquisition by constantly improving that return on ad spend. But both of these came from us really talking to the consumer, understanding why they buy, why they prefer this brand, and what are the factors that sell them on this brand versus all the other places that they could look at. And so what we found was that fit was something that really resonated with people. We would validate this live with some of their customers and they're like, yeah, this is why that stands out to me, and also helped us understand the competitive landscape and how this brand stood out. Point number 2 here is positioning, and positioning really requires focus. So if you're going to position on a particular attribute or trait, how do you make sure that all areas point to that particular focus, that particular trait that you want to be known for? So here's an example of, I'm going to take again the client name off of this, but this is an example where we were asked to help with the sales presentation of a SaaS brand. And this is an example of one of the core slides in their opening pitch deck. So as they start to present their capabilities, this is one of the key slides that they hang on and spend, maybe 10 minutes on during the presentation. So they would consider this sort of a tentpole moment of their presentation. As we dug into this and tried to understand the context of what the situation is that they're walking into, what they're trying to sell on, and what their core message is, and what they want their audience to take away from it, we are able to simplify this and focus it, because ultimately what they're saying is, our technology allows you to not limit yourself. All of our predecessors are going to limit you in some way. And with you use us, you're not limiting yourself. And so rather than showing all of the hairy details with it, we moved that slide basically to the appendix and cleaned it up a little bit and just hit the point. What we found was that this audience was not highly technical. And so we really needed to just make that point come across strong. And if we get into a technical conversation, we can say that for another day. So again, part of it's also just knowing the journey and the stage that you're at, and what is the point that you want them to take away, and how do you focus on that rather than sort of clutter it with so much technical detail that is difficult to digest. What I would say is this is pretty common. There are common, one of the common things we see is that I believe most brands, they have this fear of starvation, that if we don't get every point across, that we are going to starve somehow. What I think that looks like is it ends up being indigestion, and especially indigestion not only to the brand who's trying to communicate all of these complex details, but also to the audience. They just see a lot of noise, and so if you can just focus a little bit more, you won't have that feeling of indigestion. Your audience won't either. They'll be able to digest that information and understand it. So it's being awesome at 100 things. It's really hard. Successfully communicating those 100 things, even harder. So it really does start at the top of the organization, making sure that you're very focused on what you are, what your product is, what your service is, and then be able to communicate those pieces. And if there are, let's just say 5 great points to communicate, let's do them one at a time and know the sequence that we need to show those in versus all 5 all the time. Attention is very low. This is not a surprise. It's always low. And so again, the reminder here is you got to be sharp as a knife. You have to be able to cut through, and it requires focus. So point number 3 here is the copywriting has to be captivating. You guys have seen everything. If you've been on the internet at all, everything that you can imagine, you've already seen. Standing out is not easy. So you have to be able to captivate and grab attention. What is the opening line? How are you going to open up strong? That is both visually and through copywriting. You have to grab people's attention. I saw it said recently, the job of your first line of copy is to get people to read your second line of copy. And I think that's so true. You have to be able to grab their attention, and then the goal is to then hold on to that attention. It is very difficult to do that, but you can't waste people's time with a long setup that's taking a little bit too long. At the same time, how are you going to close strong? There has to be a point to what it is that you're communicating. So what is that rally cry? What's that mantra? What is that action? So every message that you put out there, how do you grab their attention? And then how do you wrap it up in some valuable way that you get them to move down to the next step? If you're looking for a way to stand out, one of the best ways I found is to make it just a little bit off. Don't follow best practices so closely that you fit in. Find ways to make it just a little bit off, a little bit different. If you break a rule or two, people really notice. We're very highly skilled consumers. We can smell advertising a mile away. So if you break a rule or two, people will really take notice. The trick is to not break too many rules. If you break too many rules, then it just looks messy. But that's a freedom. That's a fun one to take. Is if you're going to slow their scroll, find a way to be just a little bit different, a little bit off, a little bit more unexpected. You can make every second count. Number 4 is the hierarchy. So we got to be clear. So once you grabbed attention, you bring them into, let's just say, the consideration set. You have to display information in a structured way. So at some point, you are going to have to say, you know, do you want A, B, or C? What is the plan that you're going to want? It really helps to make sure that you know what the information is for them to make a decision and nothing else. This is an example that is fairly standard, but it's labeled well. There's a clear price. There's an action that's very easy to see. Right below that, there's validation that, hey, this button you're about to click, it's a good idea. And just to be sure, there's check marks here showing this is exactly what you get. So you've seen a million of these, but I would say this follows some good rules here in the sense that all 5 of those, I would say they've checked off their list well. So having clear structure, always looking at it, refining it, seeing if one outperforms better, if you have more details, less details, more validation, less validation, things like that can be helpful. 5, the other thing that's ever present and often doesn't get enough budget behind it is design. This idea of being attractive. If you ask most people, is design and aesthetics critical or nice to have? I think they will probably say critical because they assume that's the right answer, but it's true. The truth is it's mostly nice to have. If the budget allows for it, then they'll do it. If it doesn't, they just move on to the next thing. What I would say is that when you're trying to grab attention, which is a very rare asset, design gets it. It basically says subconsciously, I should pay attention to this because someone else paid attention to it. You can tell when something is well designed. You can tell that someone put time and attention into that. And I think we reciprocate that subconsciously. And so that's how I continue to look at design is there's a lot of ways to look at design, but to me, it is how much attention went into it, how much attention should I then mirror back to it. But it really comes down to the B word, it's the budget. And so without an ability to quantify design, you're probably never going to have enough budget to justify having strong design. So let's just look at it from a very high level. We're going to step out of marketing for a second. Just look at design with a capital D. In 2015, there was a study that really caught my attention. There was a firm that looked at the 16 most design-centric publicly traded firms. So brands that you would expect, like Apple, Nike, Starbucks, Target, like we all know that they prioritize design. It's very clear. Every touch point you see, very well designed. So they studied them, and they started at 2005 and went over a decade and said, do they outperform the S&P 500? Do brands who prioritize design, and they had a number of factors that they evaluated this on, do they outperform? And the truth is they did. They outperformed SP by about 211%. So it makes for a strong case. In fact, I remember at this time thinking I should invest in all 20 of these, but at the time I didn't buy individual stocks. I still don't. But they stopped that study in 2015. So we continued it and wanted to see, did they stop it because it actually didn't hold up? Or did they stop it because they moved on to something else? So we continued this study and traced it all the way up to last year. And it has outperformed it even more so. So the S&P 500 has grown at this point, when we measured it, 173% based on where they stopped 5 years ago. But the DVI continued to grow by 601%. So it wasn't just one individual stock that rocketed to the top, it was many of them. So almost the majority of them outperformed the S&P 500, and a few of them are very high performers. So again, this is one of those cases where if you don't know how to justify design, it can be quantified if you isolate it in the right ways. So again, strong design pays off. So let's talk on number 6 about personalization and being human. If you hear the word personalization, what do most of you guys think about? When I hear the word personalization, and I would assume many of you hear that word, you think of MarTech. How can we use MarTech to insert, dynamic variables and address people by their name and preferences and things like that? When I'm talking about personalization with messaging, I'm actually talking more about how do we make this feel a little bit more human. Here's an example that stood out to me whenever I saw this. Chewy, they do the slow, hard thing. They have a personal note handwritten. They actually commissioned an artist to paint a photo of this customer's pet, and it completely surprised them. They got it posted online. It made the rounds. Is this an example of messaging? In some ways, people would call this more of a brand gesture. But to me, it's a good reminder that when you do something that feels human, it really stands out. People take notice. They've done something here that's a little bit wrong. Chewy has all the abilities in the world to do highly technical personalization, and yet they still do these very slow, one-off things that actually get them major notoriety because the world takes that, and then they spread it around themselves. And so you basically have the customers sort of validating them on a mass scale. So it's a good reminder that sometimes just do the thing that feels a little bit more human. You might be surprised at actually how a one-off catches the eyeballs on way more people. And then the last one we're going to talk about is context. You've got to be there, right? So the message has to get in front of people. So this is now when we start talking about channel strategy and those types of things. What I've seen in my experience is oftentimes the major downfall of channel strategies is that they're inherited, right? So it's inherited from previous years. Decisions were made in the past, and then there's only small tweaks on it. There isn't as much rigor as is needed. And so one of the things that we try to look at is we really try to dissect and break down the channels that we're using. And we look at things that like stage. Where are we spending our time? Are we in the awareness, consideration, conversion, retention? Where are we investing our time and energy right now? Are we in a more of a push-pull environment? Do we need to be generating attention, or are we acquiring existing demand? How many people are we trying to reach through these channels? Is it more of a shotgun to the masses, or is it more of a rifle to very highly qualified customer candidates? Where are we at in the brand cycle? Do they know us well and we just need some quick reminders? Or are we in an introduction stage and we need to tell the full story somehow? and we need really good quality time to be able to stand out. And then you also need to look at the resources and effort required. If we're going to go down this path of pursuing these channels, is this something easy that we're well staffed for, or is this complex and we're going to lack resources for it? And then the last factor we're going to talk about here today, and there's many more, but is just the value duration. Are we good with a flash in the pan and renting eyeballs, or do we want maybe a slower, more organic and owning eyeballs? And so what we try to do is we try to find the right mix of what is needed, and then we look at the channels versus just shooting from the hip and saying, well, it seems like people in our industry like to use these, 4 channels. Let's go this way. It's also an opportunity, I think, when you evaluate on these factors, you could have a channel mix that's so wildly different than your competitors, and that's a good thing because you're going to stand out to a different set of customers versus just being in that sort of red ocean of competition, battling it out on the exact same channels that your competitors are using. So we hit you with several points. We do have a framework that we can send you. I've got my email address up there. If you write that down, you can hit me up. I'll shoot this over to you. It's a PDF with a 10-point list. So some of the factors that we talked about today. This is just a way that what we do is when we have an idea on what a message could be or how we present a brand, we really try to grade ourselves to say, is it as strong as it can be? And our goal here is with these 10 factors is to answer at least 4 of them very well. What we find is when we come up with an idea, we fall in love with it, and maybe only 1 or 2 of them can we answer well. And by trying to figure out, okay, well, how can we get it to open stronger? How can we make this have a little bit more emotion to it? It always strengthens the message. So this is our most requested framework that we use. It's just a simple checklist to kind of grade and strengthen your messaging. And I'll be happy to send it to you guys if you shoot me an email after this presentation. So with that, again, here's the other framework that might be worth a screenshot or printing this out. Give your messaging a quick grade and see where you sit. It could be that you're overperforming. If that's the case, you should go tell somebody. Tell somebody that you found the messaging that's overperforming, but then keep pushing it from that point on because it just keeps getting better and better. You don't have to stop once you pass the industry standard. So just to wrap it up, guys, messaging, it can be a lot of fun. And we've all, I think, picked this industry for a reason. It's not just to grow things, it's to have fun along the way. So what I've found is if you can stay loose, you can stay light, you can actually be a whole lot more effective at your work. So that would be my parting message before we chop it up here. So thanks, guys. Thanks for listening.